if let's say Open RAN was, maybe Fujitsu's having some struggles, but let's speculate that other companies aren't doing so badly. And one thing that has happened in Open RAN is that a lot of these specialists have decided it's worth branching into areas they weren't in before. So Mavenir, for instance, which we might talk about in a minute, started out as a pure software player.
Indeed.
And then went into radios. They might go, well, we'd be quite interested in acquiring Fujitsu's radio business. It's something that you could possibly have seen them doing a couple of years ago.
Well, I mean, maybe you can comment on this now. I don't think Mavenir's got a ton of spare cash, has it?
No. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen now, but, there is a scenario in the past where you might have seen that kind of thing happening. So I don't know. Maybe they're hopeful that they can find a buyer for it.
Yeah.
And it's partly to do with that.
Well, I mean, it could come back to this American thing, of onshoring, and that they've obviously got a bit of a grudge about the fact that there isn't a homegrown network vendor.
Yeah.
So yeah, potential buyers of Fujitsu thing. I mean, Samsung might be one. Some American company. It's so hard to think of any American company that would look to make a big play.
Yeah.
In network, you mentioned Mavenir, and they would be one if their financial situation was a bit more healthy and it felt like they were in a position to make big bets, and it just doesn't feel like they are.
No, it doesn't. And the trouble with Samsung buying them is
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast, our second one of the week. Ian's just had his first sip of beer and dribbled some of it down his chin, so that's a good start, isn't it, mate?
It's,
it could be...
Blame it on the evening.
Yeah, exactly. So we have been out and about since then. Last night we met up with a PR agency called Spark, who were just having drinks for the hell of it, I think. And that was really good fun. Got to give it a few shout-outs there. The two people who run it are Anna and Kewal. I hope I pronounced that right. And we had good chats with them. We had a good chat with Chris, hearing about doing audiovisual reviews on YouTube.
That's right.
And we had a good chat with Kathy, and Kathy actually just pinged us an email to say that she enjoyed the chat. So nice one, Kathy. In fact, I might reflect on that chat a little bit more because it was some quite interesting subject matter. Mm-hmm. And then, I ended up getting home very late, partly because I left late. So right at the end, there's another person who gets a shout out, and that's Kat. She sort of led me astray and said, come and join us at the bar and have this shot. Something, I think vaguely remember something weird and pink.
That's the moment when I left.
Yeah. And I just hung around chatting to her and chatting to Kewal. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. Sorry again. And then, I got to apologise for not saying goodbye because I was chatting to them and just getting lost in the moment. And I suddenly looked at my phone and saw the time. I thought, fuck, I'm going to miss the last train. So I just legged it without saying goodbye. So apologies for that. But luckily I made the last train. Unfortunately, it decided to take about an hour and a half, about 3 times longer than it normally would.
Were you the last journalist out? Were you the last journalist
standing? I think
standing?
so, yeah. As is so often the case.
Well... it's good that you always managed to maintain that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it always leads to that slight... I mean, not too bad, because I sort of own my own bad habits.
Yeah.
But it leads to that sort of slight sort of murmur of recrimination when you're like, why can't I just go out for a couple?
Yeah.
What's wrong with me? But then again, it's a laugh, isn't it? And I had really good fun. It was great chatting to them all. And so, that's normally how my internal dialogue goes. A bit of self-reproach followed by, but it's got to be done, hasn't it? So I'm not feeling very well rested, but I'm all right. I'm not hungover for some reason, even though I was on the old fashions at the end, mate.
How many old fashions did you get through?
I don't know.
I had one before I left. I remember that there was one bought for me.
Definitely had a few more. And I mean, when I left it looks like some of them from Spark were still up for larking about for a while.
Well, they're all quite young, aren't they?
A lot of them are, yeah. I mean, other ones I haven't shouted out to, but I remember us remarking when we got there that we felt like we were in a sixth form common room.
Yeah.
But yeah, they just got lots of young people there. But it's a cool agency. Anna and Kewal have done a great job, and they're good fun as well. So yeah, shout out to all of you. In fact, before we move on to other stuff, the conversation we had with Kathy was interesting. We were talking about AI and the use of AI for writing.
Yeah.
And Kathy was sort of saying some ways in which it can be useful for, I don't know, proofreading or structuring or something like that. Whereas you and I adopted a fairly sort of Luddite, I think it's a sort of.
But everybody's got a limit to what they're willing to accept, and that's where you draw the line.
Yeah. Well, I think. Go on.
You view these things like previous forms of automation and machines that got used in the 19th century, whatever, as a tool, don't you? But obviously, some people weren't very happy about the kind of initial tools coming in for.
But this is where I think this is different. I mean, it is a tool.
Yeah.
It's not sentient yet. We're not a Terminator yet.
Yeah.
It is a tool.
But that seems to be the point of difference with Kathy, is that she still regards it as a tool, whereas for me, it's gone past the point of being a tool. I think in terms of some of the stuff that she was talking about doing with it.
Well, I think where I certainly dug my heels in was just when you get into the concept of authenticity and your own voice. As journalists now more than ever, us journalists are a dwindling bunch.
Yeah.
Thanks in part to the fact that there's so much free content out there. And one of the ways in which we will differentiate ourselves, apart from doing good old-fashioned journalism, like finding shit out that isn't in the public domain and then writing about it, is through our writing voice. And I'll let other people be the judge of whether or not I've got a writing voice and whether it's something I should particularly want to preserve. But I think without that voice, you're at risk of becoming very commoditized, and you almost might as well hand it over to AI.
Yeah.
And I guess my concern is if you lean on AI even a little bit, so it's a slight thin end of the wedge argument, but if you lean on AI a little bit, does it start to eat into your voice? And do you start to get lazy as well? Like sometimes, you more often than not open your stories with a sort of narrative flourish about something sort of tangentially relevant. And you're obviously having fun writing it, and you're presumably hoping that the reader will get some entertainment as well as information from what you've written.
Yeah.
If you start leaning more and more on AI, maybe you just stop doing those bits of narrative flourish and,
you
stop
would.
putting your personality into it.
That's one of the problems that I've got with it, is it's taking away from the parts of the job that I quite like doing, and I think we were talking about it being used for maybe not for that at this stage, the actual sentence by sentence stuff, but I think Kathy was talking about, and by the way, Kathy, write in and say that I've completely got you wrong in terms of what you were talking about, but I think she was talking about using it for structuring arguments and coming up with initial ideas and this sort of thing. But I like that process. I don't want to cede that to generative AI. The other thing that worries me about it actually is this gets to the authenticity point. It's actually worryingly good, I think. It's got to the stage where it's worryingly good. And what scares me...
I remember Dean saying that he could get it to write a fairly decent research paper.
Yeah, and that scares me because I don't want to find myself reading something and liking it and then finding out that it's actually put together by generative AI. I'd feel kind of cheated.
Yeah.
And Yuval Noah Harari, who's a kind of AI philosopher, if you like, he writes a lot on this topic. He actually thinks there should be disclaimers on stuff that's produced with AI content. Yeah. The trouble is, but even there, it's a very hazy area, isn't it? Because if you've used generative AI a little bit to help you get, to help you find a starting point, or maybe just to do some proofing or whatever, does that then become regarded as AI content?
Point. Yeah, totally, I agree.
Or does it have to be something that's been largely written by AI before it's regarded as AI content? But I think it's all quite scary. I think it's just quite... it's leading to sort of cognitive laziness as well. That's the other problem. And this is a problem educationally. I see this going on with GCSEs at the moment. There's a lot of we need to revise Romeo and Juliet and come up with some ideas about what he means in Act 3, what this scene represents. I mean, in our day, you had to go to the library or talk to your teacher or think about it yourself. Whereas these days, they just run it through Gemini, and you've almost got your answers there at the ready, and you can put it into an essay. I mean, even if you don't have to tinker with it too much.
That's a sort of extension. I actually, I might not have mentioned this on the pod before, but before I got into journalism, I dabbled with teaching for a bit. And I was mainly just doing personal tutoring. But I did have one, apart from, I think I've mentioned that I used to teach in Wormwood Scrubs Prison.
You did.
But then I also did have 1 year of teaching in an actual school. It's a private school in Belsize Park called the Hampstead College of Fine Arts and Humanities, and I was teaching maths and environmental science. And I remember once, and I was teaching like 14, 15, 16-year-olds. I remember once getting getting some homework back from a girl, and it was printed, and there were paragraph blocks, and some of them were in different fonts and font sizes.
Right.
So clearly, she'd copied and pasted this shit off the internet.
Right.
And then, as I said to her when I was telling her off for doing that, I went, look, if you're going to cheat, at least change the font sizes and standardise the font sizes, because I mean it's so obviously a copy and paste job. So that was what was happening like 20 odd years ago. Whereas now, I wouldn't be able to catch her out.
You wouldn't be able to catch her out. That's the problem.
No.
I don't think you can tell nowadays what's been done, and so people aren't youngsters who would have had to go and actually sit down and think about what Romeo and Juliet means and come up with their own ideas on it. They don't bother doing that anymore. So you're taking away the thought process, basically.
No, you're spot on. That, and I mean that's a critique of conventional education on the whole, is that it doesn't teach people to think for themselves.
Yeah.
It teaches people to memorise and regurgitate.
Yeah.
And there's another thing, that's really important for. Look, I just emailed Kathy to say I'm about to give you a shout out on the pod, and she went, I'm famous. I think that AI risks even entrenching that inability to that lack of training people to think for themselves even more.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things, like when we're doing the podcast, one of the reasons I feel relaxed about it, especially if we've got a guest on, is I think that you could ask me almost anything and I'd be able to formulate some kind of vaguely coherent thought on it. It might not be accurate, it might not be good, it might not be worth hearing, but I wouldn't just clam up.
Yeah.
Because over the course of my life, I've just naturally trained myself to form opinions and positions on things. And that's one of the fun things about doing this pod, isn't it? We get to act them out and flick them on other people. And so if you're just going, if someone goes, Scott, what do you think of this? And I just go, hold on a sec, AI, what do I think of this? This is what you think, and then just regurgitate that back. Then I'm completely taking my higher brain out of the loop, aren't I?
Yeah, and the other thing that's a problem with it, which gets to why it probably won't replace us, is that although it could get better, obviously, but none of it's original. I mean, we're all coming across a lot of Gemini generated content at the moment because you can't use Google now and not come across it. And it's very obvious looking at Gemini what it does. It really is a scraping of material that's out there on the internet that it kind
that's
of
all of them. All LLMs are that, basically.
Yeah, but I think because I've not really used ChatGPT very much because I sort of regard it as the devil's tool, so I don't want to go near this sort of thing.
Yeah,
but you can't avoid Gemini, so that's my first sort of interaction with this stuff. And clever as it is, and actually quite useful sometimes, just for sort of as a starting point, just for sort of answering queries. You see the stuff that's getting thrown back at you. I've seen my own content being thrown back at me because I'm obviously doing quite a lot of searches on things like radio access network chips and this kind of thing. I've seen things coming back.
But your stuff's been sort of repurposed within an AI
sometimes not even
narrative.
Very repurposed. It's like they've been their bullet points it tends to put together. They're almost my words that I've seen coming back at me. So it's a very clever student, a kind of someone who's going to get a 9 at GCSE at Romeo and Juliet, is going to be the person who goes off and really comes up with some original ideas about what this play means. Yeah, but
I don't know if the grading's even that sophisticated.
Well, that's what should happen anyway.
Yeah.
And I think A levels probably reflect that a little bit more than GCSE.
Well, degrees do in principle, but I mean, I remember chatting to my dad who went to Cambridge in the 60s.
Yeah.
And he was of the opinion, I've heard other people saying this, that, at Cambridge then it was all about rewarding people for original thought.
Yeah.
But the assumption is a generation or two later, even that isn't, even in great places like Cambridge, it's not being rewarded so much, it's more just rote learning.
Yeah, well, this is certainly what it should be. When your dad was there in that era, that's certainly what it should be.
Yeah. Because
that's what leads to breakthroughs and innovation and new ideas about stuff. And AI is a long way from doing. I mean, AI is just it's scraping the internet. It's a very clever search engine. And it's not doing the other thing. I think one of the good things about our job maybe that it can't do, and this gets to that, is kind of what we were doing last night. I mean, last night was a PRD, but you might find yourself at one of those dues with someone from Ericsson or Nokia or Vodafone or AT&T. And they'll chat to you and they'll go, this is off the record, but you might want to have a look into this. And then you meet someone else at another do and you you find something out that's going on and no one's written about it. You can't find it online.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you've got the makings of a story that generative AI wouldn't be doing that because until the point where they're sending around replicants like Rutger Hauer to go and to go and do what we do, then
or Daryl Hannah.
That's sort of off limits. Yeah, that'd be better.
Yeah.
I'd rather have that.
Yeah.
Less scary as well.
She'd be able to get information out of me quite easily.
Yeah. Well, she is actually quite scary in that film.
She is. Yeah. And then just one last thing on that sort of opening tangent, and you've touched on it already, is the potential for obsolescence. So we talk about it in telecoms quite a lot, how people who just can do old school telecoms, all these various, a lot of the stuff that Dag was chatting about earlier on in the week, and shout out to Dag, that was a great pod, really good fun. Good. Got some good traction on LinkedIn, lots of people found it fun. And Dag put a LinkedIn post going, he had no idea what he was letting himself in for. Because I remember he said a very funny thing. We went off on an opening tangent talking about the Pope, and he's like, am I on the right podcast? But yes, the obsolescence, the people who know how to do all the nuts and bolts telecom stuff, there's a broader narrative about how younger people aren't learning that stuff anymore, and in part due to automation, which is, let's face it, a form of AI.
Yeah.
And apparently, and I remember Danielle on the podcast we did from Mobile World Congress talking about her son's like learning coding, and it's soon going to just be supplanted by just getting the AI to do the coding.
Yeah.
And so does that mean that people like her son, and my son's about to do a course of a similar kind, that they're going to stop doing it? Are we going to get to a stage where people don't know how to code? And that's worrying. And then going full circle back to our sort of precious, you can't replicate our clever words narrative, do people start forgetting how to write?
Well, this is the problem, isn't it, though? I mean, not being able to... I do worry about the kind of generation that's doing GCSEs at the moment and their ability to do some basic stuff when they're older. Things that have been considered important ever since civilizations came about. Basic cognitive things.
Yeah.
They're just losing those skills, I think. And the coding one's even scarier in a way. But given how reliant we are on technology, we are basically saying that the only things that know how to code are AIs.
Yes, a machine.
So if something goes wrong with the code,
totally,
and no one's coding anymore, we need the machines to fix the code.
To get the veterans out.
Yeah, but at some point the veterans are going to die. Yeah,
indeed.
So
indeed. So yeah. So, but then having said all that, I think Kathy made some great points about its utility as a tool. And I think there's no doubt that, when I force myself to step away from the cliched apocalyptic view of it all, it could, like any form of sort of automation, it could make life a lot easier. Like you look at, for example, there's some sort of stat about a typical, I'll say housewife, but, a typical person who runs the home, to not sound misogynist. What is it? 100, house husband,
house wife. I regard
wife,
myself as.
House person in their own right. 100 years ago would be spending like 8 hours a day just doing basic shit like washing and cleaning and all that sort of thing. And then obviously washing machines come along and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And AI could well apply that to lots of other areas of life. So repetitive, tedious tasks that you can just leave AI to do. But as ever, we get back to the thin end of the wedge. Once you start relinquishing that stuff to AI, where does it stop? Do you relinquish more and more and more?
It's definitely getting rid of writer's block, because at least he could give you a starting point for something, whether it's a book or article.
Well, that was the example given last night, I think.
Right.
Maybe by Chris, actually, not Kathy. We were talking to him about it later.
Okay.
I think he was saying that he sometimes uses it to come up with a starting point. But even that, to me, I want to come up with my own starting points. I like doing that kind of thing. I don't want AI doing stuff that I rely on my brain to do and that I actually quite like doing.
Well, creativity. I think
but that's for people who have to write about something they're really not interested in.
Putting present. I get. So this is where I actually would pull back on some of the stuff I've said is things like corporate presentations.
Yeah.
Nobody enjoys putting together a corporate presentation that you've got to give to a boardroom of people about some spectrum issue and it's full of bullet points and charts. Now, that kind of thing, I get why you might use AI to help you do it. I completely understand that. And I might even do that myself. But but writing content that you're putting up as a journalist is quite a different thing, I think. And I think if you take it I think we got to the point of talking about novel writing last night, which is something that you've done, but I've never done that. I mean, that to me would be a massive line drawn where AI wouldn't go anywhere near that.
Well, totally. And actually, I was just going to mention that.
And if I knew that a novel I'd read, by the way, had ever had AI used to produce it, I'd be incredibly upset. This is get back to the
You'd
point.
feel robbed,
really
wouldn't you?
cheated. Imagine if you found out, and it wouldn't be, this wouldn't be a good example because he's been around too long to be an author who'd use it. But someone like Robert Harris, whose books I really love, for instance. Imagine if I found out that his last few books have been produced using generative AI or something. You'd feel really cheated, like you'd sort of wasted your money.
Would there be a degree of disappointment if it was
really disappointed.
If it was obviously completely done by AI, you'd be very disappointed. But what if it was 10%, 20%?
I'd be disappointed if I'd known that he'd gone anywhere near it.
Well, again, that comes back to the thin end of the wedge thing. Maybe that no percent. I mean, talking about novel writing, and for those people haven't bored on the podcast about it.
There we go.
My book, Identity Crisis, is available on all good Amazons right now.
In the store near you.
Go ahead and buy it. Take its sales into double figures for me. Is one of the things I most enjoyed about writing it was the creative process.
Yeah.
So much of that book I had no idea was going to appear until I started writing. And then you start writing and you think, oh, fucking hell, look, I'm going here. Didn't even know I was going to go here. And that's so the creative process, whether it's writing or music or art or whatever. I think that should be an AI-free zone. And I think this is one thing
movie scripts, that would be terrible.
Yeah,
I think AI has been good at coming up with premises.
Anything with movies. I mean, I get you're going to use. I don't know. You're going to use AI maybe in generating some special effects.
Yeah. That's what James Cameron was saying. Actually, it might not. I mean, he's being, I think, optimistic. Is that the guys who do the CGI? He's like, no, it might not replace their job, but it might then be way more productive, and instead of 2 days, it'll take 6 hours, and they can move on to other things. I'm like, yeah, okay.
They're talking about these days the AI generated movies, aren't they? Completely AI generated movies that don't really have actors in. They have a likeness of Nicole Kidman or whatever. Which you can do pretty convincingly. I mean, there's footage going on around the last few days of Donald Trump playing football and dribbling it past a load of people. And
the AI fakes are just getting so convincing.
It doesn't look great, but it's still something that if you looked at it 20 years ago, you'd have been, what the hell's going on here?
I think it made crazy, funny things possible, Like it'd be like, you never see this person do this, and then there it is. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's funny.
I think my sort of final thought on it, and I think this did come up in our conversations last night as well, was just the concept of authenticity. And I always think, whatever success, for example, this pod has, I think half the reason, this is the feedback I get from people, is they just buy into us. They know we're being authentic. We know that we're being ourselves. And I feel that about pods that I enjoy. I almost feel like I'm befriending the people on it because I've got to know them, because I've heard them talk and dick about so much. And I think surely AI, with AI fakes being so powerful, so convincing now, that's just going to put an even bigger premium on authenticity. Back to your point about being reassured that what you're reading is actually someone's work and not auto-generated. Because
people are interested in other people. That's the important thing.
Yeah.
Anything creative, you listen to a piece of music and you think, whether it's someone playing a brilliant guitar solo or just the composition itself, you think, well, that's amazing, they've been able to do that. Or you read a book about someone who's trekked across Africa and it's like, what an amazing achievement. But people don't want to read AI or listen to AI.
Well, you don't.
No, I don't think anybody really does. I think if it got to a point where the things that we've been entertained by are all coming from computer systems and not from other people.
Yeah.
I think most people would view that as being quite dystopian.
Yeah, I would.
Do you remember Paul Miles from Warzone? We had this theme at the Geneva Motor Show on I think the last video we did together, where it was a little bit like the analogy with people like a Casio, but they also like a Rolex.
Right.
And then at this show, it was like electric cars everywhere. But then they were like, naturally aspirated Lamborghinis and stuff. And people still like that too.
Totally.
So
yeah, I mean, this thing, I won't go down this rabbit hole, but I'll just nod to it. This thing we got in the UK of phasing out petrol or non-electric cars by a certain date is such bullshit.
where are we going to charge?
Well, but leaving aside anything else, is a civil liberties thing. What if I want to buy a fucking petrol car? I don't think it's for the government to tell me I can't, but there you go.
What is it? You'll be able to, but not a new one? Is that it?
Yeah, they keep moving the deadline back because it's such a stupid idea. And as you say, there isn't the infrastructure.
Yeah.
But yeah, there'll be a deadline after which they start. They start basically banning the sale of new petrol or diesel cars. Which anyway, that's a completely different topic. But yes, okay, that's interesting, that whole AI thing. And I think it's interesting. I do try and make myself give AI benefit of doubt and not just lazily, as I do, lapse into the dystopian Terminator stuff, amusing though it is.
Yeah.
Because it's here to stay, and it can probably do a lot of good. I mean, there's some ways it could do a lot of good, like in terms of social stuff. Like, for example, maybe in poorer countries where people still do spend a lot of their time just doing drudgery and repetitive, shitty work. If it can automate a lot of that, maybe it can elevate, sub-Saharan Africa and make the GDP per capita a lot higher or something like that. So those are all positives.
The DeepMind guy on 60 Minutes, I think, recently said that within the decade, I mean, he's like, my job is the most important job in the world. But he said that within a decade, AI could solve all diseases.
Right.
Which I think is ambitious, but I don't know.
Yeah.
This sounds like Sam Altman, silly utopianism.
He gets very utopian, doesn't he?
No, but like you said,
to solve all the problems of the world.
He could do good things like nuclear fusion. Here's all the data, figure it out, and then cancer.
Yeah, well, things like because a lot of what AI is, certainly in its current form, is just an incredible amount of compute.
Just a huge
taking
brain.
place.
Yeah.
There's one. It used to be quite fashionable in the sort of geek world, which is called protein folding, where basically a lot of biochemistry involves getting a protein, which is just a long string of amino acids, but it can form itself in lots of different ways on a molecular level. And so you just have to go through and test out every fold, i.e. every different manifestation of that protein, and that requires a lot of compute power. And that's supposed to have really good biomedical benefits. And so now, to your point, yeah, maybe we could do that and get to the bottom of a lot of things. Anyway, we should talk a bit about telecoms as well, shouldn't we?
I think that's kind of relevant.
Yeah, no,
used in our
I really enjoy it. I was just picking a random segue to move on from it. Unless you've got anything else you want to say on the matter.
We can always come back to it.
Indeed. Yeah, we might do actually because, well, I'll leave that there, but we may well come back to that. So it's obviously only been 3 days since we recorded the last podcast. I think the biggest bit of news since then has been Nokia's quarterlies.
And
so,
Google, well, not Google, to a more broader term.
Well, we don't tend to.
But in telecom.
No.
Yeah, I don't tend to write up big tech quarterlies unless I'm desperate for a story, just because, as Ian says, there's not enough of a strong telecoms angle, and obviously countless other people are covering that sort of thing.
And was the Nokia thing covered properly, Scott?
Well, I'm so pleased you asked, Pierre. We'll get back to that. I certainly know Ian has some opinions on the matter. So we'll talk about Nokia's quarterlies, and there was plenty going on there, plenty to dig into there. I think we're going to talk a little bit about sort of RAN stuff. There was a bit of news about Fujitsu sort of spinning off its network operations, and I think both Nick wrote it for us, but you wrote it up, Ian, and both of us were a bit like, I don't know, struggling to see what the cunning plan is there.
Yeah. We seem to have one.
Indeed. So, and then another RAN related thing.
It's more like a sort of get away, please.
Yeah,
go and do your own thing.
And another, it's quarterly season, and Intel's quarterlies come out, and they're still having a bit of a nightmare, and there are some potential telecoms implications there. As people will know from me teasing Ian about it, he's a specialist to an almost maniacal extent on silicon in the RAN, so we could take that one as far as we want. And I might just finish off. There was oops, I haven't muted my phone. There was a regulatory thing in the EU where they're fining Apple and Meta under this Digital Markets Act, or one of their bits of legislation that's designed to keep an eye on big tech and stop it being monopolistic. And that's mildly interesting by itself. But what I think is a bit more interesting is the American reaction to it, and how symptomatic that is of the current vibe coming out of the political establishment in the States. And then I've just got a broader, not particularly coherent sort of thought process on the collateral damage. It kind of touches on what we said at the end of the last pod, the collateral damage being done to NVIDIA in that particular case. But there's so many other forms of collateral damage, so we'll see how we're doing for time. But I might go off on that little tangent. Let me just mute my phone. Well, why don't I start off by handing it over to you, Ian? Why don't you take it from the top on Nokia's numbers?
Yeah, it was quite an interesting quarter for them because it was the first one with a new CEO. Although he wasn't there for the whole quarter, I think he took over his job at. In fact, he's only just taken over the job, so he wasn't there for any of the first quarter because it's calendar year, isn't it? So he came into the role on the 1st of April, but it was obviously up to him to kind of report the results.
Yeah, well, Pekka Lundmark's off.
Pekka Lundmark's
chilling,
gone, had enough of doing. Had enough of doing these earnings calls, and I think he came out with a number of how many he'd done in a row. Not just basically Nokia, but
he's essentially going, "Fuck that, I'm bored of it."
Yeah. So they've got this new guy, Justin Hotard, who's formerly of Intel, which you might talk about a bit later. I think he was head of the data center and AI group at Intel.
Yeah.
And he's now at Nokia. He's joined at quite a difficult time, I think, for the telecom industry.
Yeah.
It's like a big challenge, really, trying to do anything with these companies while telcos aren't really spending very much money.
Indeed.
Especially on mobile infrastructure, like the radio access network market's been really it's been down a lot. I mean, sales fell a lot last year and they fell a lot the year before that, and there's an expectation it's going to be quite flat this year. But Nokia's had some setbacks there, so there's been questions about the future of mobile. It has this big network infrastructure unit that includes assets to do with internet protocol products and optical equipment and fixed line, which is in a much stronger position. I mean, that's kind of described by him on the call actually that I was on this week in the morning as the kind of big growth.
Yeah, you're harder working than I am, and you actually get up early to go on.
They do. So he's maintained that system. It's nice to see. They do this call with reporters that happens before they go off to do other things that are more important with analysts, but it's sort of 8:30 in the morning finish time, which is a 2-hour time difference, so it's 6:30. So if you want to get on it, you've got to get up pretty early. But yeah, I think it's worth it because there's not a huge number of journos on it, and you get a chance to sort of ask questions and try and get something more out of him. But the results they report is they've got basically 4 big units. They've got the mobile networks business, which is in a difficult market and has had some setbacks anyway, I think, in terms of losing a bit of market share in some parts of the world, which we'll come on to. There's network infrastructure that's positioned quite well because of interest in kind of connectivity for data centers, really, inside and between them, which is all linked to this kind of AI stuff we've just been talking about. They've got this cloud services unit that's doing okay. It's doing pretty well, I think. They've got quite a good reputation there. And then they've got their licensing unit that kind of flogs, They
call it Nokia Technologies.
It's a kind of profit machine, basically.
Yeah, it's basically, I mean, I remember when they sort of created these business units, it was about 10 years ago. And it was, it was kind of around the time when Nokia had made its peace with the fact that its time as a big handset maker was over.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps it had already flogged it to Microsoft by that stage. And then Microsoft ended up writing off the whole value of that acquisition. So that was a bit of a misstep by them.
Yeah.
But they used to spend billions every year on R&D.
Yeah.
And they've just got a massive portfolio of intellectual property. And they thought, fuck it. People still need to license it. Some of it will be standard essential. But there'll be all sorts of little wireless patents and obscure little bits and bobs that you need to make things work. And so, as you say, it's pure profit because they've already done the R&D.
So the R&D's booked elsewhere in the business.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so it's like I've talked to people at Nokia before and it's like, well, obviously there's costs in doing research. It's just it gets booked elsewhere.
Oh, I thought it was because it was all legacy But
no, it's still to do. But the innovations that Nokia's coming out with year after year to do with, and they're obviously contributed to 6G standards, or will be, and all this stuff is stuff that they can move into that licensing unit. That they get involved in a dispute with some Chinese smartphone maker where it's using a bit of technology that they claim they've got a patent for in 6G, let's say, and they'll make some money out of that. But the money's been spent in mobile networks itself, basically, to develop this stuff. So it's basically pure profit. And it was actually a little bit overlooked in the coverage, I think. Nokia Technologies was the main reason they didn't have a great quarter, actually.
Yeah.
So there's, I think their headline sales, and you're going to have to correct me if I get figures wrong here, but I think their headline sales declined by sort of 3% on a constant currency basis year over year.
Yep.
And that was largely to do, even mobile networks, I think, was up 2%.
Correct.
And
network infrastructure was up 11%, and cloud was up 8%.
Yeah, 11%, and I think even more with I think 11% organically, but reported it was something like 20%, wasn't it?
Correct.
Which is probably to do with the Infinera takeover that they completed quite recently.
so they have to,
but it's still
like for like.
It's in a good position, that unit. Cloud up a little bit, so you see these units are actually doing quite well. But then they had a really unfavourable comparison with the year earlier quarter at Nokia Technologies when they had a bunch of what they call catch-up sales. I wasn't really sure what that meant, but I guess it just means you kind of book a lot in one go for things that you've been chasing, I suppose, and deals that you've been trying to get done.
I think the way it goes with Nokia Technologies is it's not just and they probably have got some revenue streams that are steady, sort of licensing sort of things, but it's more often than not, it's big licensing sort of resolutions where someone like Samsung or whoever comes up with a deal where they license this IP for 5 years. And so you'll just get that one-off payment that covers 5 years. And so that's obviously going to lead to irregular spikes in the revenue for that unit.
Yeah.
So that was what they said. And I don't know enough to query it, but they basically said Q1 24 was exceptional. Q1 25 isn't exceptional. That's why there's a drop-off of about half.
350 million or something euros. It kind of fell.
It halved.
Yeah, halved.
Yeah. Exactly, about that much. Yeah.
And therefore, that's not just coming off sales. That's coming off gross profit, because they're booking everything as gross profit. So it really tears into your profitability. So they had this. So even though their headline sales are only down like 3% constant currency basis, I think if you look at their net income, and again you have to correct me here, I think it fell from something like 512 million down to, if you look at it on a comparable result.
You're doing well so far. Let's see if you get the second number right.
It's something like 160.
Close, 153.
153.
Pretty good, mate.
Million.
Pretty good.
Yeah. So it's like a big drop.
70% profit fall.
Yeah.
I mean, other things. I mean, the way I wrote it is that their gross margin declined by 820 basis points, and then everything that percolates, that cascades down from that.
Yeah.
So all the profitability, so operating profit margin, EPS.
Yeah, everything took a bit of a battering.
Yeah.
And their licensing stuff was actually the main factor, but a lot of the attention was on other things. Two in particular. One, unsurprisingly, was tariffs, conversations about tariffs. And I thought some of the reporting was a bit misleading on all this, to be honest with you, because obviously tariffs haven't
That's what we were alluding to earlier.
Tariffs haven't had an impact in the first quarter.
No.
But they could do, of course. And
although I suppose, to be devil's advocate, and he didn't say this, but I suppose you could argue that they might have the threat of them might have affected some kind of sentiment, but there was certainly nothing concrete.
Although when Ericsson reported, tariffs were actually a good thing for it in the first quarter, because one of the consequences of the worry about tariffs, they said, was that a lot of American customers went out and spent a huge amount on equipment. Because they wanted
to get ahead of it.
Because they wanted to get it in before the tariffs come.
Yeah, there's definitely been. I mean, this has been happening for years anyway. But there's lots of stockpiling going on in China, for example.
Stockpiling of stuff, basically. So there was some sign of that going on with Ericsson's results. Nothing I picked up on with Nokia's that was an equivalent. But just in total, I mean, Ericsson came out with its estimate. I mean, tariffs is like a moving target, obviously, because a few weeks ago they looked like they were going to be absolutely catastrophic, with every single country getting hit with these ridiculous levels. Then they all got lowered to 10%. China was still on 145%. Then all of a sudden that's been pulled back, it seems. So we don't really know what's going on. But I think Ericsson had their estimate was it was going to lower their gross margin by 1 percentage point this quarter, which I worked out was about I think it was about 50. If you work that out on a first quarter basis, about $50 million.
Right.
And Nokia is saying this quarter they expect tariffs to lower operating profits by 20 to 30 million euros, I think was the figure
Correct.
they gave.
Yep.
So clearly it hasn't had an impact so far. It will have a small impact on their ability to achieve their targets. I think they're looking at between 1.8 or 1.9 billion euros and 2.4 billion euros that's their guidance for operating profit this year, which is at the midpoint. I think it's quite a bit less than they made last year. But the main reason why they might struggle to hit that, and the other thing that hit their profitability was this charge they took for a settlement payment, and it's all a bit mysterious. And I remember getting asked about it last night while I was out with you.
Yeah.
If someone was texting me, I won't name because it'd be insensitive, but someone was texting me about what do you think is going on here, and I don't really have any insight on that. But they might as well give her a call out, Gillian from Bloomberg, on the call in the morning. The very early call, she was the journalist who sort of asked them specifically about that. Can you say who that is? And she assumed it was to do with AT&T. And I think they'd said in their report, which no one really had a chance to look at that stage, that it was actually an older deal. It dates back to something that was announced in 2019.
Started in 2019.
Started in 2019. It's another customer, another project. What it is, I don't know, but he thinks they've drawn a line under it with this settlement payment. But it's 120 million euros. It's quite big. It's the other reason why the profits have taken a beating this quarter. And for him, he was saying that it was unexpected, obviously. So that's the reason why this target they've got, this operating profit target, might be at the higher end, harder to achieve than they previously expected. I know there's a bit of speculation going around in industry circles that it might be linked with T-Mobile US.
Well, that was something I think you and I were chatting about last night, because I think I asked you.
So that was the other bit of news out from them yesterday.
Yeah, so that was the interesting thing, is at the same time as coming out with their quarterlies, they announced that they'd had a big renewal with T-Mobile US for their RAN stuff. They called it their 5G stuff.
Yeah.
And then when you and I were chatting, and this is just pure conjecture, it's not based on any inside knowledge that I'm aware of, but I suddenly thought, yeah, that is interesting that those two things have coincided. And you can imagine if hypothetically there was a dispute over a previous deal with T-Mobile US, and they'd been reporting, both Light Reading and Telecoms.com had reported on rumours in the past. I think it was... And there was an analyst called Earl Lum had speculated about it.
Yeah.
That maybe T-Mobile US was thinking of ditching Nokia.
Yeah.
So it would make sense if there was a dispute that T-Mobile US went, okay, we'll renew with you, but you better make up for that thing that we've got a dispute about.
Yeah.
So yes, narratively that would make sense, but that's pure speculation. We don't know.
Yeah, it's total speculation. But I mean, if it is linked, if it is somehow to do with T-Mobile US, I mean, that doesn't sound especially good, clearly. I have to say, I think it's a bit unlikely that T-Mobile US would renew a deal with a company whose radios it wasn't very happy with.
Indeed.
If it really saw a massive problem with the equipment it was being provided, it wouldn't be a case of let's have a 120 million euro settlement payment, because it would foresee bigger problems than that in the future.
But don't you think part of the narrative here for Nokia is that was then and this is now? So in 2019, that was still when the FPGA stuff was going on.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that deal, by the way, I think it was public information at the time, but that deal they got with T-Mobile on 5G was worth about $3.5 billion.
Yeah. That was another thing we were chatting about, because I was trying to get a sense of what proportion of the value of the deal, of this deal that we don't know who it was with in 2019, this 120 million euros would account for, because it seemed like a big chunk of change, but then the size of the deals are in the billions.
Yeah, it's big in terms of See, here's the thing: is like settlement payments do happen from time to time.
Yeah.
At other companies as well. Like I'm sure Ericsson's had this sort of thing going on occasionally, and it's certainly had payments it's had to make in the last few years for things like misdemeanors in Iraq and quite substantial ones actually, like really quite hefty ones.
Those are that's a different thing. Those are fines and this sort of thing. This feels like just an SLA sort of.
They are fines. It's a totally different thing. But all I'm saying is when those things have happened at Ericsson. And clearly, it's had an impact on profits, and it's kind of upset performance. But I think the worry about Nokia, if I'm looking at Nokia, is because the mobile networks unit was already in a tough situation financially. Anything like that happens, it really, really hurts its margins. I mean, I had a look, and I didn't put this in my story. I think we were talking about it last night. But I think if you put the 120 million back in to Nokia's like gross margin, they're still reported a loss, I think.
Well, I've got I when I'm doing these things, I quite often take screen grabs of either the presentation or the accounting tables, and I've got the accounting table here where it's split by. This is how I was able to confirm that you were spot on 99% of the time a minute ago, and the profit loss just for mobile networks. In Q1 24 was a loss of 32 million euros.
Yeah.
And in Q1 25, 152. Just so happens to be €120 difference.
Yeah.
So yes, so they're having to book. So all that 120 millions is being parked at mobile's doorstep, as quite rightly so. But yeah, that's taken their gross margin down 10 basis points.
Yeah, but if you take that off, that 120 million, you're still left with a small loss.
The same loss as the same quarter last year. So they're consistently making 32 million euro losses.
Which is not a good position to be in. And and you look at what's happened top line at mobile networks. It's this loss of this AT&T. So let's go back a bit. Let's go back to late 2023. What's happened at Nokia's mobile networks business? We talked about this loads before, so regular listeners will know this. But they lost this big deal with AT&T.
Yeah.
And this came about 3 years after they'd lost a similarly big deal with Verizon to Samsung at the time. Quite different circumstances. Back in 2019, 2020, they were not in a great position. You were just talking about all those FPGA problems. They're using quite expensive components in their 5G products. I think that it wasn't just that. There were other things. I think the whole 5G, product situation was a bit of a mess. And it isn't anymore. And my view is it isn't. I think they've actually got a really good set of products. I think, you look at it objectively and they're in a far, far better position in terms of their portfolio.
Yeah.
And I think this T-Mobile US deal proves that to a certain extent because they wouldn't renew a deal with a company that they thought was having massive issues.
And that was my point earlier. Even if the dispute was with them, they would say, well, yes, we fucked up 6 years ago, but look out, we're kicking ass now.
So the AT&T move wasn't to do, and I know there's been speculation about they were very unhappy with radios and they didn't like fans being included in them. I think from my perspective, I think the real reason was that AT&T wanted, and they pretty much said this themselves, and Ericsson said this, they wanted they wanted to have this sort of horizontal layer of service management and orchestration, and then kind of put things on top of that. Maybe even just have one vendor of baseband software as well, which is kind of what they've got at the moment. And then any kind of diversity that you've got and any alternatives come in other areas like radio units and RIC applications and this sort of stuff. But certainly across the kind of foundation on the software side and the management side, it's one provider, and that's Ericsson.
Yeah.
And it was, and when they were making the decision about doing that, it was much easier to go with Ericsson than it would have been to go with Nokia. Ericsson might be a bit ahead anyway. Let's be honest; they are the market leader, and they're very, very highly regarded.
They're all in
doing
on mobile,
but they also happen to be the company that was providing 2/3 of the footprint rather than 1/3 of the footprint. So picking Nokia would have cost them more, basically. If you accept that once you make that decision, you're going to have to take out the other provider's stuff, it would have cost a lot more to go with Nokia anyway. And I think that was kind of what drove that decision. But the consequence of it is the US market is probably the most profitable market for these companies.
Yeah.
And we've chatted about this quite a bit before. It's where they get most of their their margin from.
And Europe, it's the broader concept of the which kind of feeds into some of the stuff I might talk about at the end. Still was to do with geopolitics and all that sort of thing. But there's a general, someone once told us that basically the US consumer is subsidising the European consumer.
Yeah.
Because the ARPU there is about twice.
So the only reason Ericsson and Nokia can sell like low-cost gear to the Europeans is because they're getting enough money to keep going from the Americans,
and the Indians.
basically.
Yeah.
Well, and the Indians. That's not a very profitable market at all, apparently, from what I've been told. But
no, and it's kind of weird, isn't it? You can imagine. You can imagine Americans getting a bit annoyed. You're going, hold on, you're selling more or less the same shit to India for half the price. What's going on there?
I mean, to be honest, no one really talks about this. So the more that people like us write about it and talk about it, the more it's like the sort of thing that someone like Marco Rubio is going to get hold of at some point and go, oh, this is outrageous.
The latest grievance.
Yeah.
We should shut up.
I almost feel bad for doing it in a way, but yeah, it's definitely an issue. But to go back to Nokia, I think this has really hurt it on the sales side, and it's hurt it more on the profitability side. So their margins are really kind of under pressure. And if you look at what they've done in terms of their cost cutting, which was a program that got introduced by Pekka Lundmark before Justin Hotard, to take out a lot of jobs. And I looked at the numbers. I looked at the last annual report that came out a few weeks ago, and they've gone down. At the end of last year, they had about somewhere between 75,000 and 76,000 employees, down from about 87,000 in 2023 at the sort of average level. And you go back a few years, they were more than 100,000 workers there. And apparently most of those cuts that have happened in the last sort of couple of years, year and a half, couple of years, have been at mobile networks.
Right.
And I when I sat down with Tommy Wito, who's the head of that unit at Barcelona, and I was asking about this. He was very sort of determined to sort of say, well, we haven't cut into R&D. We've preserved the jobs that are kind of the high value ones, and it's been admin and it's been that kind of stuff. But it's a real challenge. It must be a real challenge for him to have to sort of deal with this situation of
definitely
of it's just a lot to kind of juggle and balance. And then this happens, and all of a sudden your profits are kind of, you're in a big loss,
and when Hotard was announced, I sort of rather cheekily went with a headline saying that Nokia's just pivoting towards USA and away from mobile, because Hotard's obviously more on the data center, which will be the network infrastructure side.
Yeah.
And obviously Nokia would push back on that, but I still think it wasn't a completely disingenuous throwaway conclusion to come to, that given the background of the person that they'd chosen to employ as their CEO. And of course, there is a ton of money in data centers in the US. They're spending billions of dollars every quarter on creating new data center capacity, although that does seem to be slightly plateauing. You hear about Microsoft canning a couple of projects and that sort of thing. And there is a slight sense of over-exuberance and overbuild.
Yeah, well, tariffs isn't going to help any of this stuff, obviously, like the economic situation.
Yeah, well, part that we'll bring that can come up in the general collateral damage section at the end.
Yeah. I mean, that's maybe the nice thing for Hotard, though. What you just said is that at least he's got this big unit network infrastructure that looks like it's in fairly good shape, and better than good shape. It's doing very well.
I'll tell you some. I've got like operating profit loss by division.
Yeah.
And they're doing well. Last year, network infrastructure got a profit of 85 million euros. This year, it's 135.
Yeah.
And cloud and network services has gone from a 37 euro loss a year ago to 37 million euro loss a year ago to 14 million profit.
Yeah.
But it's still hilarious. And then mobile is the only one that seems to now be consistently losing money, even, as you said earlier, even if we take out this one-off exceptional thing.
Yeah.
But what's hilarious is Nokia Technologies. Basically, the whole rest of the business, more or less, I don't know, breaks even or runs a little bit of a profit. And then, what was it? Nokia Technologies last year, out of a total profit, last year's Q4 was funny. The total profit for the period for Nokia was 512 million euros. The profit from Nokia Technologies was 658.
Right.
So
its losses elsewhere.
Its losses elsewhere. And so even though Nokia Technologies is a very small proportion of revenue, it's all profit. And so in terms of profitability, when you've got the other divisions just about, network infrastructure seems to be going from strength to strength, but between the three of them, sort of more or less breaking even or just eking out a little bit of a profit, and then you suddenly get a shitload of profit, where their official gross margin in Nokia Technologies is 100%, and then their operating margin...
like 70, isn't it?
Well, last year it was 86.9, and this year it's 70 because of that.
Yeah.
Because of that year-on-year comparison.
Yeah.
But yes, so it's an interesting business they got there.
Yeah.
And they obviously were very wise to create Nokia Technologies because it's a fucking license to print money.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Just a bit less this
I
quarter.
think Ericsson's quite similar. I don't think it breaks it out in the same way. They kind of book it with maybe mobile networks. There's a line that you see what percentage is licensing, but I think they kind of rely on. You often notice when their margins have improved quite a bit, it's usually because there's been some licensing deal that's been done. So it's a similar thing. You know, you book the costs elsewhere and you treat that as a kind of profit machine, and you run around and chase these smartphone makers and try and get them to sort of cough up some money basically for patents they're using and it's a good thing they are doing that, I guess, in a way, because otherwise they'd be in bigger trouble than they are.
But I think Nokia on the whole feels like they sort of turned a corner compared to when we used to talk about them a year or two ago. On the whole, looking at the numbers and looking at the areas that they're invested in, like this data center interconnect and all that sort of thing, it feels like it's a company sort of on the up to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the data center AI, the optical IP fixed business should take care of itself, really. You know, I mean, they've got to work on that integration of Infinera with their own optical assets, and they seem to be quite confident about handling that. It doesn't seem like there's an excessive amount of geographical overlap. There's the products that are quite complementary, from what I've been told. You get into sort of complicated stuff like talks about indium phosphide and silicon photonics, and one was focusing on one was focusing on the other, but you can sort of keep both of those elements there. You don't have to replace one with the other, sort of thing. So that if they can manage that well, that's a great asset for them to have.
Yeah.
But if you take that away, the mobile networks is. I kind of want it to be doing better, you know, because we need a couple of big hit makers in the market that are doing well.
Not just like 1.5.
Not like 1.5.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that need to fill that role of being the other big one, really. And it's just a worry to see that as you say, if you plug that 120 million back in, that they're still reporting a small loss.
Yeah, and the same loss as a year ago, so they haven't improved.
By the way, after hefty cuts, after cuts that have lowered the overall workforce from 86,000 to 75,000 in like a year and a bit or whatever it's been, and when they don't break out who's in which bit of the company and where the cuts have. Which exactly how many jobs have gone in each area. But when I did ask Pekka Lundmark about this a few months ago before he went, he said most of them have been in mobile networks, most of those cuts. And
because
it's like at some point,
got the most margin pressure.
At some point, you're just you can't cut anymore. Yeah,
no.
you can't go down to not having people doing some of those admin and sales roles. And it's all very well saying we'll protect R&D, but here's the other problem I think for Nokia on the R&D side. And when I asked Justin Hotard about mobile networks and does it need further restructuring there, he gave, you could argue it was maybe a bit of a woolly answer. It was basically reaffirmed their commitment to it. I wouldn't have expected him to say, we're looking for a buyer.
We remain committed to.
Yeah. Or we're going to do something dramatic. But
although there have been rumours about them
for a long time, they have
flogging mobile networks, isn't it?
But he was he was like, we're still committed to it. It's still a massive strategic asset for the Europeans and the US. And then he sort of hinted at we need to do something on the R&D side. We need to carry on investing there. That's one of the really big differences between Ericsson and Nokia over the last 4 or 5 years. Is Ericsson's R&D budget has gone up massively.
Right.
It's really gone up. You look at what they were spending under Hans Vestberg, and it's something like 35 billion Swedish krona. I don't know what that translates to. It's say 3.3 or something, 3.4 billion US dollars. Last year, under Ecom, there were about 5.5 billion US dollars they spent. They've massively increased, like about $2 billion annually. They're spending more, and most of that's obviously going into mobile because that's what they do. They do mobile stuff. Nokia their R&D spending is basically flat. They've not cut it. There was a time when they were cutting, I think, under Rajiv Suri. It looked like the figure had gone down.
Right.
And that's when everybody was like worried. As soon as you start cutting R&D, people start to get very nervous, especially when your products are going a bit wonky and you're using FPGAs and you're not quite getting things right. And, oh, by the way, there was an R&D cut. It doesn't look very good.
Yeah.
And
why would someone invest in a company that isn't investing in itself?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they've stopped doing that, but they've not really raised R&D. They've kind of kept. And the problem is, you lift R&D spending, you're gonna hurt margins more.
Indeed.
You're going to run up bigger losses. But if you don't raise R&D spending, you're going to lose competitiveness. So this is the big question, I think, for Justin Hotar when he looks at that mobile business, is he's got to sort of figure out if they are going to keep it, they're not going to sell it. I know there's been a lot of speculation about selling it, but I struggle to see that happening in a way. But how's he going to sort of turn that around? Because maybe it does need him to accept that for a while they're going to have to run it at a loss to sort of recover something. I mean, he was quite upbeat about them clawing back their product competitiveness on the call, and he views it as being in a very good position in terms of adding things and capabilities it didn't have a few years ago. But you still wonder whether it needs a bit of extra oomph. I don't know, and you accept you're going to run up losses. The problem with doing that, of course, is the market's not growing. This is a struggle for investors to. To hear, isn't it? Is the market?
Indeed, and what is the ROI on R&D? Because even if you, I mean, this might be. At the end of this, it might be a good segue into
5G. That's the question,
quite.
Isn't
So that might be a bit of a segue to our next bit that we're going to talk about anyway. One last point I want to make about Nokia before we do that, unless you've got anything else to say. Well, two things actually. One is share price. So their share price fell by about 7% yesterday when the stuff came out. Although it should be noted that about a third of that was cancelling out a jump that had happened at close of play earlier on this week for whatever reason.
Right. Some bit of news, some buyback or something.
Yeah, or some bit of news will have come out that gave it a little spike. And then the other point I'll make is some of what it lost yesterday has been recovered, such that over the course of the week, it's only down about 3%.
Right.
So I think there was probably a bit of an overreaction to whether it's that exceptional one-off thing or whether it's unexpected news about a hit they're going to take on tariffs or whatever it was.
I think it's
that drove it down.
I think it's the we might not hit guidance.
Yeah, but see, my only you said that to me before, and it makes sense. But my only query with it is they're not going to hit guidance because of something they've already announced.
Yeah.
So they're not saying we think we're going to fuck up in the next quarter. So I just would have thought that would be priced in. There's this one-off hit to their profitability for this settlement of 120 million.
Yeah,
and that's why they're not going to hit their guidance.
Yeah, but it's only been priced in as soon as you said it because no one knew about it before.
I guess so. So basically, people are just pricing in that it's got 120 million less than they thought it would have.
Yeah,
it's the long and short of it.
Yeah,
but
and maybe they didn't factor in what's going on at Technologies as well, Nokia Technologies. I don't know.
Yeah, but I think on the whole, its share price hasn't taken that much of a hit.
It's still up, I think, year on year, isn't it? I think over the last 12 months, it's still higher than it was.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
So looking at year to date on Google Finance, it was $3.64 on April 25th, 2024. It's now 4.97.
Yeah.
So yes, there's some oscillating. But I don't think that, basically I'm saying I don't think the market took that news particularly badly, even though it seemed like a big
and it's quite volatile at the moment anyway because of tariffs. I think all of these companies have been moving around a lot, haven't they, over the last few weeks? They all took a bit of a hit. They all took a big hit, actually, it seemed, on April the 2nd, Liberation Day.
Yeah. What it really was liberating pension funds from their value. And just one last thing I want to say about Nokia is looking at their numbers again. Where is it? Here. In terms of the two big divisions, which is network infrastructure, which is basically all the fixed line stuff and data center interconnect and all that sort of thing, and mobile networks. Year ago quarter, mobile networks brought in 1.682 billion euros and network infrastructure 1.439. Now it's nearly at parity.
Right.
So networks is only ahead of network. Mobile networks is only ahead of network infrastructure.
It's 7 billion. It's
by 7 million.
7 million, yeah.
And so presumably to extrapolate that next quarter, it will be the first quarter, I think.
Yeah, that it'll be the biggest.
The network infrastructure will be the biggest. So the direction of travel for Nokia is away from mobile, albeit mobile still being a major part of its business. And, and it's got these other areas where it seems to be in the right place at the right time, like defence. At a time where Europe and basically anyone who's been historically dependent on US support for their defence is being cut free. Or at least that's the rhetoric.
Yeah.
And so they're all making a big noise about, right, fuck it, we're going to buy some guns and shit. Might
even make our own guns.
We might even make our own guns, yeah. Although we'll probably have to have a meeting about it for 4 years before we make one. And so it's not a bad time to be in defence. So basically there's two areas, and we've said this before, there's two areas where Nokia seems to be in the right place at the right time. One is data centre connectivity, and the other is defence. So I just think that whatever happens with mobile networks, I think we're increasingly going to be, that's increasingly going to be a smaller piece of the pie. Now, Tommy Wheato would presumably disagree, and you're welcome to come on any time, Tommy, and put us straight. But that just seems to be the direction of travel for me.
Yeah, I mean, the outlook, I think, for RAN this year is like flat or slightly growing outside China, according to Omdia. And obviously Omdia is the best ones because they're a sister company of ours.
Indeed.
So they must be. And that compares with quite a steep drop last year of about 12%. So the market looks better, or it should look better. Although actually some of the news out of it so far, this is a bit of a segue almost, from other RAN companies haven't been very good.
Well, let's just go there.
Yeah. But I'm saying, I mean, if Nokia can AT&T's gone, Verizon's gone, that's in the past now. Move on, focus on what's next.
Yeah.
They've retained T-Mobile, it seems. That's what this deal seems to imply. Details of it are a bit hazy.
What proportion of T-Mobile?
See, I don't know that.
Right.
I mean, I was under the impression...
It's not a sole vendor thing, is it?
No. So Ericsson and Nokia are their two vendors, and I don't know what the percentage split is. So, but it looks like that issue is sort of kind of drawn a line under it.
Yeah.
I was a bit annoyed not to get more intel from my kind of background sources on some of the T-Mobile US specifics and what's going on there, but maybe I will next week. I just need to keep plugging away, but
keep doing that kind of journalism that fucking AI can't do.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so they've got that, and then in other parts of the world, Middle East, it seems to be always an opportunity for growth. Yeah, they've always got a lot of money to spend there, and they seem to be doing quite well there. So I don't know, maybe they can grow market share. And I mean, Huawei swap outs could be a really big thing for them in Europe.
Yeah.
We just don't know how that's going to go, do we?
Especially Germany.
Well, Germany's a big one, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, so talking about the overall RAN market, that's a sort of bit of a segue to a story that you wrote, we covered, but I didn't write, Nick wrote it for. Our headline was Fujitsu eyes global expansion with telco network spin-off. Your headline was Fujitsu expects network sales drop as it spins off assets. Seeing as you wrote it, Ian, why don't you cue it up? What is Fujitsu up to with its network bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit unclear, to be honest with you.
Right. Even though they've done a press release about it.
They've done a press release, but there are some holes in the story that I wasn't able to fill, and therefore when I wrote it, there's some speculation in there.
Right.
I mean, if you look at this announcement about this spin-off, which I think they're calling Onefinity or something.
Which is some random sub-brand they've got.
It's the name of an optical platform they've got, which is, I mean, obviously Fujitsu clearly does more than just, they kind of get associated with Open RAN because they've been very focused on doing radios for use.
Yeah, and Japan on the whole has been a big one for Open RAN, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And they're kind of players in that game, and along with NEC, another Japanese company, they kind of get regarded as the radio guys. If you're going to bring any radio units in that aren't Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, those are the sort of next options. And I think actually if you look at Omdia data, they both, once you go outside the top 5 vendors, which ends with Samsung on about 6% market share. The next one's down, a kind of NEC and Fujitsu.
Oh, you're including ZTE in
it's
that?
Huawei, Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia, ZTE, Samsung.
Right.
You get to Samsung. I mean, Samsung's market share is really quite small, even though it's like a big player.
Yeah,
it's like 7% or something. And then you go down to I think NEC's on like 1.4. And Fujitsu's like 0.8% of the market, so it's tiny. But they've kind of got this niche for doing radio units, but they do other things as well, clearly, because this name of this spin-off company has been taken from this optical platform that they produce. So they do some transport stuff, do work in photonics and stuff like that. And the Onefinity, which is what they're calling this business, will include. It seems like. This is the hole I was talking about. It sounds like they're spinning off all the telecom assets. But then if you actually look at what telecom made in revenues last year and what this new entity is making in revenues, there's a gap.
I see.
So I think the new entity's like listed in the documentation as making about 110 110 million in revenues. And the figure for like Fujitsu reporting overall network stuff is something like 180 million. I think those might not be quite right, but there's certainly a gap between the two figures. So it sounds like some assets are being left behind. Yeah, they're not moving everything into Onefinity. Now maybe that's wrong. I don't know. Maybe there's some reason why those figures don't match. But the presentation of the story as a complete spin-off of all the stuff they're doing in networks and the mismatch on the revenue side certainly raises that question that I wasn't able to kind of address really. But the other thing that's notable is if you do look at those results for network products, they're not doing very well on network products. Now, they were coming into the market, I guess, with things like with the Open RAN movement and hoping to be one of the future players, growing market share, doing a lot better than they're doing. I think their sales were fairly flat last year compared with the year before. But this year, they're forecasting like a 17% drop.
Yes.
They're forecasting going down from about 180 to 150 or something.
And so that's obviously significantly underperforming the market.
Yeah.
So they're doing something wrong.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't look like they're benefiting from this whole sort of Open RAN movement.
No.
Essentially. You've got to kind of worry about a spin-off at this stage, what it means, what they can do.
That's the other baffling thing. Other than the great points you've made about there being some gaps in the narrative and gaps in the numbers, is have they made any kind of coherent argument as to why their networking operations are going to present a sort of more promising picture as a separate spun-off thing and rather than part of the parent?
Yeah, they did. They said that it was all about management responsibility. Sometimes companies think that if you park a unit in a separate entity,
it can't hide.
It can't hide, and it's got more kind of autonomy, I guess, and it can make its own decisions and all this sort of thing. So. So I'm just looking at the figures actually because the ones I quoted are wrong. I thought they were wrong after they came out of my mouth, but
it's all right. You were on a good run prior to that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not 180 million because that's nothing. That's 108. Right, here we are. Network product sales last year were about 181.6 billion Japanese yen, which is funny money, Japanese yen, but that basically is like 1.27 billion US dollars.
Right.
And then this year, what it's expecting to happen, this is its guidance for this year, is that they'll drop 17% to 150 billion Japanese yen.
Yeah.
Which is quite a big drop in a market where, and now that isn't just RAN, clearly. That's this transport stuff as well, and other things that they do. But
you could think of that as like, a mini version of what we were just talking about with Nokia, and that it's got interest in the mobile and in the sort of fixed line.
Yeah,
sort of
exactly
sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously got some stuff that it does that isn't to do with the radio access network. But let's bear in mind the radio access network is the kind of the big thing for players to be in. That's where a lot of the spending goes.
Yeah, as opposed to core or whatever.
As opposed to other things. And And that's the bit that they were optimistic about, obviously, with the radio stuff they were doing. That this is the area that Open RAN was, the Open RAN players were looking for a bigger piece of that pie that they've not been able to capture. And then if you look at the Omdia forecast, that last year it went down 12%, the RAN market, and this year it's going to be flat. And you're saying your overall telecom revenues, by the way, the other bits of the network market, as I understand it, and as Nokia would tell you, things like optical and IP interest, that sounds like it's in better shape anyway. If your overall network revenues are forecast to go down 17% this year, and yet the RAN market's supposed to be fairly stable, and other sectors are presumably, I don't know what the forecasts are for those off the top of my head, but I would have thought they wouldn't be too bad. That sounds like you're doing a lot worse than the market to me, which implies you're losing some market share, which is not how Open RAN was supposed to go.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, both you and Nick, for us, sort of spent some time talking about the Open RAN side of things, and we'll go there because it's a good opportunity to check back in with that situation. Yeah, I just saw a quote from the press release that Nick put in our story. He goes, "The name Onefinity embodies Fujitsu's desire to become number one in network technology and the market, and to explore infinite possibilities." So number one and infinite. You see what they've done there?
Very clever.
And infinite possibilities with customers while carrying out business in a sustainable manner. I don't know what the fuck any of that is supposed to mean.
No.
But it just looks like corporate gobbledygook. And when you see corporate gobbledygook, for me, that rings alarm bells that they're kind of bluffing a bit.
Yeah.
That they're kind of just trying to spin a bit of a yarn, and what's really going on is, the other possible thing. So you said part of the narrative could be that if you put that into a separate company, everyone might raise their game a little bit more because the spotlight's on them more. The other one could be some kind of corporate maneuver where they just think this shit's holding us back. Let's just quarantine it in this Onefinity thing and stick it over there. If it loses some money, we can just go, that bit's shit, but the rest of us is doing really well.
Well, it also makes it easier to sell it potentially in future.
Indeed.
If there's going to be consolidation in the market.
And that's often when people spin off things like this, it often is a pretext to selling.
Well, I mean, to go back to Nokia briefly, one of the things that Pekka Lundmark did was end this idea that you should try and have synergies between these different business groups and do cross-selling and do this end-to-end
which was the original
thing,
bright idea with the Alcatel-Lucent thing.
He said that didn't make sense, and he gave them all.
People didn't buy that way.
He siloed them effectively. He made them more like silos. But one thing when you do that is it then makes it a lot easier to sell a bit, like mobile networks potentially, which I think is one of the reasons people were speculating that it might be sold, because he'd sort of structured things that would make that easier to achieve.
Exactly. So, in Nokia's case, that definitely did happen back. They did a restructure. I remember writing about this. It could have predated my Telecoms.com days, but they did a restructure once where they split the business into handsets, the stuff to do with Navtech, which was another failed bit of M&A that they did, which was back when
Garmin type stuff.
Yeah, exactly. That was when they thought for the handsets, they thought if they owned the maps, then that would be a unique selling point for the handsets. But then basically the one company that fucked Nokia the most is Google. Yeah. Not only by making Android available for free, but also by making Google Maps available for free. Yeah. So anyway, they spun off handsets, the sort of map tech one, and one or two other bits, and then lo and behold, they sold the Navtech thing to someone. They sold the handsets.
I remember that.
So that was definitely a precursor to them selling stuff off. And then obviously, and then all that was left was basically what we got now, which used to be called Nokia Siemens Networks, and then they bought out Siemens from that joint venture.
Yep.
And so yes, that felt like more of a formal siloing of different business groups than the current structure, which seems like more of a reporting structure, but I could be wrong there.
It's more of a reporting structure. It's not like they're different divisions. It's not like they're separate, completely
semi-autonomous,
entities. And there's presumably still central services like accounting and all this stuff, but they have their own like dedicated sales individuals representing them, for instance. Whereas I think before, and I might be a little bit wrong on this, but I think before they were trying to have sort of people go out and sell everything, this end-to-end thing. Like if you want mobile, maybe like a bit of optical stuff as well, kind of stuff.
Yeah, quite.
As a real simplification.
Well, because that seemed to be the bright idea behind what was a very expensive and disruptive acquisition of Alcatel-Lucent.
Yeah.
It's like, we'll be the only ones who can offer the full Monty, but it turns out people don't want to buy the full Monty.
No, although I still think that acquisition, I don't think it was sold the right way on that end-to-end thing. That
it's turned out all right because
I think it was a good acquisition.
It's the most successful part of the business right now.
Yeah, and also there's an argument, which I think even though Pekka Lundmark said we don't want to do end-to-end, it still makes sense for us to have a hand in lots of different areas of the network business, because when one's doing well, another one might be doing badly, which is kind of what's going on. And if you sell to a customer in one area and they like you, they might then decide to buy your mobile stuff as well. So there's obviously reasons why it makes sense to have.
Although then the flip side is, if someone buys your mobile stuff and it's shit, they might not buy your optical stuff.
But no company wants to have that anyway, do they? It's not like they would ever expect to be selling stuff and have a bad customer relationship anyway.
Yeah.
So, so to go back to Fujitsu, you could certainly see that a spin out of network assets could, if let's say Open RAN was, maybe Fujitsu's having some struggles, but let's speculate that other companies aren't doing so badly. And one thing that has happened in Open RAN is that a lot of these specialists have decided it's worth branching into areas they weren't in before. So Mavenir, for instance, which we might talk about in a minute, started out as a pure software player.
Indeed.
And then went into radios. They might go, well, we'd be quite interested in acquiring Fujitsu's radio business. It's something that you could possibly have seen them doing a couple of years ago.
Well, I mean, maybe you can comment on this now. I don't think Mavenir's got a ton of spare cash, has it?
No. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen now, but there is a scenario in the past where you might have seen that kind of thing happening. So I don't know. Maybe they're hopeful that they can find a buyer for it.
Yeah.
And it's partly to do with that.
Well, I mean, it could come back to this American thing, of onshoring, and that they've obviously got a bit of a grudge about the fact that there isn't a homegrown network vendor.
Yeah.
Potential buyers of Fujitsu thing. I mean, Samsung might be one. Some American company. It's so hard to think of any American company that would look to make a big play.
Yeah.
In network. You mentioned Mavenir, and they would be one if their financial situation was a bit more healthy and it felt like they were in a position to make big bets, and it just doesn't feel like they are.
No, it doesn't. And the trouble with Samsung buying them is there's obviously a lot of overlap then with what Samsung's doing, because they do radio units themselves. They're not a pure software player. They're not like Mavenir isn't anymore, by the way. It's expanded into radios.
Indeed.
But the criticism of their radio strategy would be that it's a lot more limited, obviously, the range than you get from an Ericsson or a Nokia, because they're spending a fairly limited amount on it. So they might have some nice, massive MIMO radios, but then if you want other types of radio for particular environments or particular settings, you probably wouldn't be able to get them from Mavenir, because they've had to focus resources on a smaller number of areas. Yeah,
and like with Samsung, they've been playing catch up on the legacy stuff as well.
Yeah. So with Samsung's quite. It's quite a big player, even though it's got a fairly small market share. It's obviously part of a huge group, and they've got a pretty broad range of products, from what I understand. So whether they'd see any reason to go and buy assets from Fujitsu, I don't know. They might just feel that it's kind of replicating what they do anyway. That's the problem for them as a buyer. Yeah. And they might not be. This is all speculation anyway. Indeed. They might not be trying to sell it. I don't know, but it's the kind of move that a company doesn't make sometimes when they're looking to flog assets, isn't it? So, and they're obviously not expecting to do very. This is the weird thing, is like they've just set up this business and said it's going to have more autonomy and it'll streamline things and speed stuff up. That's an expression they use, actually, accelerate development. All the usual corporate
to infinity and beyond.
Yeah, to infinity and beyond. But Buzz Lightyear is crashing his spaceship, isn't it, or whatever it is? He's like, it's 17% down.
We could extend the metaphor. He goes, this isn't flying, it's falling with style. So maybe that's what this is. That's right. If only you thought of that when you were writing it.
I can't remember he said that. I haven't said
that was Buzz Lightyear.
I know it was. It was Buzz Lightyear. But so he's it's not a good outlook for the year. It's like you've just spun this thing off and you're saying sales are going to fall by a sixth.
Yeah.
It's but Open RAN's just not in a very good place at the moment.
No, well, do you know what? Before you go there, I want to talk about where Open RAN is, but I also want to have a quick break, Pierre, because I'm not going to make it to the end. So let's have a quick break. So you're not getting a good feeling about Open RAN in general, Ian?
No, it's It depends what it's supposed to be, I guess.
Yes. Well, that's the biggie, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think some people I speak to, they're basically going, look, I mean, actually talking about Mavenir, I've mentioned it before on the pod, but I did a panel session on their stand at Mobile World Congress this year, and we were all talking about this. And fair play to them, even though they've got so much invested in it, they encouraged me to be sceptical and to ask difficult questions about Open RAN, that sort of thing. And one of the things they spoke about, and I also mentioned that Mickey Mikitani from Rakuten on that Sunday night thing that you weren't able to go to at Mobile World Congress. I asked him a question about Open RAN, and he just started mumbling something about energy efficiency or whatever.
Right.
The point is, whether it's Mavenir, whether it's Rakuten, or whether it's whoever, the narrative around Open RAN has been evolving quite rapidly.
It has, yeah.
And you get the impression that one of the reasons it's evolving, like a more unkind interpretation of why it's evolving, is because all the original objectives of it turned out to be bollocks.
Yeah.
But they can't say that, and they go, "No, it's just maturing," or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, to your point, like what is the point of it now? Oh yeah, and another person I think
it's another thing, by the way, also that we were talking about misunderstandings in the press earlier, that the mainstream media gets slightly wrong Open RAN. I did see a Bloomberg story, a kind of general almost one of those what's 5G all about type things, and why is 5G not gone? I mean, it was a good piece. It was a good piece on the whole. I have to say.
But they got one thing that you disagree with.
They had a small section on Open RAN. It's Gillian, by the way, who wrote it, and I thought she did a really good piece on it. It was, I mean, if I was going to be really critical, I'd say it was a kind of thing maybe that we were writing a couple of years ago, like why is 5G not really worked out the way it has? But you can always do a stock take anyway. It's like
Gillian,
people are going to carry on asking that question for the next few years. I suspect.
When we first met Gillian a year ago at Mobile Congress, she only just come over from covering like regulation in Brussels or something.
And also Bloomberg's targeting a very, very different audience from Telecoms.com and Light Reading. You would think it's a more general business audience.
Yeah, how much does like the investment community need to know about Open RAN?
Exactly. Yeah. But I thought she did a good piece, and there was a section in it on Open RAN, and that was the one bit that I read, and I wasn't quite in full agreement with her, because her perspective, she'd obviously gone and talked to some people and been told, and maybe the analysts are getting it wrong in my opinion as well, but she'd been told that it was immature as a standard and not ready to be rolled out yet. And I don't think that is the main reason that Open RAN has not worked out in the way that the industry wanted it to work out.
Right. Why don't you think that?
Well, I mean, for a start, is the standard. I mean, the idea that it's a standard
it works.
Anyway, I think slightly wrong to call it a standard, because it almost implies that it's doing something different from 5G, that it's some kind of improvement or modification. Like you're getting something better if you do Open RAN. Open RAN isn't a standard. It's a series of links, basically, between different bits of the RAN. It's like you make this interface that went from the server to the radio in a traditional network. You had to get both of those elements from Ericsson because it wasn't opened up.
Yeah.
All you've done with Open RAN is you put a bit of code in that opens it up so that you can basically introduce an alternative player. That's all it is.
Sometimes one can get into slightly sort of tricky territory of definitions, because it could be a difference between a standard and standardized.
Yeah.
And if you called the Open RAN interface standardized, i.e. an interface that everyone now uses to get between A and B, then that's better use of the word.
It would be, but even then I would push back on the idea that it's immature. I mean, it's been around now the massive MIMO side of things you could say is a bit more immature, because there was this big disagreement about how to do massive MIMO in Open RAN that led to actually a kind of split in the approaches. This is the thing I wrote about extensively last year, this Osaka meeting where they came up with different options if you want to do Open RAN, to do with keeping the equalizer in the radio, or do you put it in the distributed unit, all that stuff. That bit of it is
all that stuff where you go elbows deep in it.
Yeah, that bit is a bit immature. But if you're talking about massive MIMO being used in remote radios, not massive MIMO radios, like more basic ones, that's been around for ages now. That's not immature. The reason that those companies haven't advanced in that area, I don't think it's anything to do with the technology. It's to do with the fact that there's multiple reasons, but it's fundamental economics and the issue of how many companies an operator wants to deal with, a big operator wants to deal with. In a market that's worth 40 billion euros, $40 billion a year, 35 billion now, gone down from 45 billion in 2022. Those aren't conditions. Margins are super thin. We've just been talking about Nokia.
Yeah.
one of the biggest RAN players isn't profitable at its mobile networks unit. Ericsson's always, Ericsson seems to be doing very well, but they had margin issues themselves years ago. You know, these aren't massively profitable companies in the way that Nvidia is, you know, with its 70% gross margins or whatever. These aren't the conditions. It had seen years of consolidation, by the way, before any of this happened. These aren't the conditions in which new entrants are going to come in and thrive. Because if they did, the big kit vendors would be losing sales in a market that's not growing. If you take business from them, if you take market share from them, rather, you're actually eroding their sales because the market itself's not growing.
Indeed.
Which means they're even worse off, which means a company like Nokia that's already looking like it's not in the best position financially in mobile is then going to be racking up even bigger losses. And then all of a sudden you've got this situation, well, maybe Nokia is not stable anymore in mobile. Maybe it's not got a future. So all you've done is replace Nokia maybe with a cluster of some Open RAN companies that are, they don't have the R&D funding anyway. They don't have the net cash that Nokia's got on its books. It just didn't make sense. The whole idea of it economically just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and a lot of the initial promises. So you're sort of covering one of the big selling points, which was vendor plurality, which would in turn lead to both greater innovation and lower prices, which hasn't happened.
Lower prices in a market that's already shrinking, where vendors aren't making any profits.
Quite.
Why should the vendors?
It's not a problem that needs solving.
Why should the vendors not be paid for what they're and be able to make a decent profit? But the telcos, by the way, I get why the telcos want to reduce prices because they're not doing very well, and obviously anybody wants to put pressure on their suppliers and pay less. But I don't think it's a reasonable argument, frankly, that they want to try and get prices down.
And the operators are always moaning about something or other.
They're always going to be moaning about prices. But
and then the other one, which I think I still cling on to. I think that when I've brought it up with you in the past, you don't seem to find it as significant a factor as I do. But is the sort of America First bit, where there were lots of noises in the previous administration, I think, about supporting Open RAN and chucking public money at it and wanting to have a national champion and all that sort of thing. And obviously that's gone to the next level with the current iteration on Trump, which we'll finish off talking about, where they've become extremely nationalistic and jingoistic and even more America First, at least in their rhetoric.
Although I noticed none of that's really extended into Open RAN, has it?
No, well, so that's why I mentioned it. That's another thing that was a big narrative at the start, which has tailed off.
Yeah.
And all I think Open RAN is now is it's just table stakes. I think eventually, as upgrade cycles, as obsolescence cycles go through, when people get new kit, they'll just go, yeah, fuck it, make it Open RAN compliant.
Yeah.
But it won't. It's nothing more profound than that.
Well, this is why you could view Open RAN as actually it's been a tremendous success, and it's everywhere because if Nokia and Ericsson are saying, well, it's baked in, all the stuff we sell in future will be Open RAN compliant. All of a sudden, that problem that you had of not being able to put a radio from one vendor with a baseband unit from another is fixed. But what difference does that make to the structure of the market?
All you've got at the end of the day
is still 3-4 players.
It's more or less the same shit, just using a different interconnect.
Yeah.
For that little bit that Open RAN is concerned with.
I don't doubt there'll be some instances, and there are clearly, where people are taking advantage of that to mix and match. But I don't think that means we're going to end up with a massively more diverse radio access network market, because the structure of the market economics
and that's where it's relevant to the Fujitsu story. If there was that demand for more vendors, why isn't Fujitsu doing better?
And here's the other reason Open RAN hasn't worked, which is sort of linked to that economic side, really. But it's not anything to do with the standard not being mature, is even when you open that interface up, putting one vendor with another still requires a considerable amount of effort on integration, so I've been told by people who do this kind of thing, and somebody needs to do that. Now, what happens when you go and buy all of your shit from Ericsson or all of your shit from Nokia? They do all of that. It's their stuff they're integrating. But it requires a lot of work by them to do that. They spend apparently a huge amount of money on systems integration within the companies to do all that stuff, and it's not easy. So if you're taking a radio from Samsung and you're combining it with some baseband software from Mavenir, and that systems integration has to be done, who's going to do it? Someone's got to do that as well. And I know some of the operators seem to think that they should play that role. Like Vodafone's talked a big deal about one of its reasons for hiring all these software experts is that some of them can get involved in systems integration. But to me, that sounds like a very hard sell to a telco shareholder at a time when everybody, we were talking the other day, I'm sure with someone, I can't remember who it was, about telcos should be more, I think it might have been Dag on our last podcast, they should be more focused on services and customer service. And
yeah, well, that's part of his pitch for Alianza. It's like, let us deal with all that boring stuff.
You could say, of course, he's going to say that. But yeah, that's the main concern. Any shareholder in a telco is obviously mainly concerned about how they approach you and me. And whether they can get us to spend more money with them, whether they can get us to be more loyal customers. The last thing they want to be told is that they're going off and messing around with systems integration. And by the way, it means hiring 5,000 people who don't come cheap.
Indeed.
And is every telco going to do that? Where are all these people going to come from? So instead of having them at a few big vendors where they've been up to now, all these operators all over the world are going to somehow get access to these people to do their own systems integration work.
Yeah, what's in it for them?
So the concept itself, not for technical reasons, but in terms of how economics work and how big telcos like to deal with big vendors. AT&T wants to know that it pushes a button and it gets straight through to Ericsson and it goes, we've got a problem, come and fix it. It doesn't want what Dish has got, which is a million different vendors. Like, its list of suppliers is longer than the Torah scroll, isn't it?
Thing in Nokia, that whoever that was that managed to get 120 mil out of them. Yeah, that's a lot easier done when you've just got this one partner.
Exactly,
and you can
they don't want
extort
the hassle of doing that because they're service companies. Why would you want to get involved in all that stuff? And now I get the only way I'm sympathetic towards Open RAN is I get the concern about being dependent on a few big players at a time when we've banned Chinese companies, when Nokia didn't look in very great shape a few years ago, and when your only alternative, if you rule out those ones I've just mentioned, is Ericsson.
Yeah,
it's like, well, that's not a great position to be in, is it? That the only company we can get this stuff from is Ericsson.
And another interesting thing, actually, that Dag said on the pod earlier on this week was we were asking about why Microsoft's acquisition of Metaswitch hadn't paid off, and he was obviously careful, to sort of choose his words with respect to Microsoft carefully. I think they're a big partner of theirs, but he sort of basically went, look, it's not their core competence.
Yeah.
And this is another problem with the Open RAN thing, that the thought that if you opened it up, loads of people for whom RAN isn't their core competence might just suddenly decide to get involved.
Yeah.
And for all the reasons you just said, it's a shitter idea than ever right now because there's so little growth in it.
Yeah.
So I agree with you and Nick on that. And I think Open RAN, I think we're just going to stop talking about it in a few years. It's just going to be baked into the cake.
People have loved talking about that. Here's my issue with Open RAN. I might even write a story on this at some point, but I wonder if Open RAN...
You quite often do on Monday.
Yeah, I'm wondering if Open RAN has been an unnecessary distraction for the industry. You think about all these groups that get set up and you've got to work on this thing that I mentioned in Osaka, like figuring out where would we put the equalizer and how do we support this and developing products that support it is obviously consuming resources at big companies that aren't doing brilliantly at a time when the market's shrinking. It's not brought any new players in. So all it's done is probably set the industry back, you could argue. You could argue that time and effort would have been better spent elsewhere.
Certainly been a distraction in terms of like what people have been talking about at Mobile Congress and that sort of thing. And as you say, they call it the opportunity cost, don't they? If you're talking about that, you're not talking about other shit.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I think it's a failure. It's just not what it was cracked up to be. I think it's a good development. Obviously, you look at at other interconnects like USB on computers and that sort of thing. A standardised interconnect is always a good idea.
It is a good idea,
but it isn't necessarily a source of growth.
It's not going to change the structure of the market.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's certainly not going to spur revenue growth, which is the industry's big problem. And that's what I mean. That maybe instead of all this shit to do with Open RAN, they should have been thinking about stuff like that in a more sensible way than Vonage.
Yes. Right. Look, we're running out of time. I want to just touch on a bit of the geopolitical stuff. Obviously, it's the elephant in the room all the time right now. Although, to be fair, in the last week or two, it's at least been relatively quiet regarding Trump's sort of
he's
impulsive
he's
shit.
slipping back into his shell, hasn't he? After having to sort of climb down in the face of China's refusal to
there
do a
was
deal.
actually I touched on that. Both the Wall Street Journal and the FT have been writing narratives saying that the only thing that makes Trump back down is when markets all go crazy.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, I don't see how anyone could be surprised. This is the thing I find weird about it. I'm not an economist. I'm very much a dilettante when it comes to talking about this stuff. But even I sort of think, hold on a sec, if you suddenly say that everything costs 10 to 100% more, I don't think you need to be an economist to think, well, that's going to have some fucking effect, isn't it? And so what he thought, I don't know. But all I really want to talk about is there was a particular story, a news hook, which is the EU periodically likes to have a go at American big tech.
Yeah.
And it always feels justified. And I think often it is. It's stated reasons. Say what you want about the EU. It's thorough. And its stated reasons are normally to do with monopolies. And the problem with American big tech is they've formed natural monopolies. And you get to a point where you get so big in a certain market, like Google in search, where even though you haven't done anything illegal to get there, you're a de facto monopoly because fucking 80% or whatever plus of all the activity happens on your platform. And that's why this happens with the duopoly on mobile as well. When you've got a duopoly, you've got a sort of spontaneous cartel because you only need to keep an eye on one competitor. If they raise their prices, you might as well raise yours as well, and then everyone makes more profit. Rather than if you get a larger, more diverse market, you can't do that because someone's always going to undercut you. And so we've got this is Nick again for us. His headline was, this was from a couple of days ago. EU lays the smackdown on Apple and Meta with fines totaling hundreds of millions. And basically, it's using this one of its big digital bits of legislation called Digital Markets Act. And Apple's being done for doing its usual shit of trying to put a massive sort of wall around its app store so that it gets to control everything and it gets to rent seek from everything that goes on in the app store. Which again, you could say fair enough. They created the app store, they created the iPhone, they've enabled all these things. They should be able to rent seek from it. But EU's going, yeah, but you're doing it too much.
Yeah.
And then Meta, reading Nick's thing, Meta is alleged to have failed its duty to seek users' consent before combining personal data kept by Facebook and Instagram for the purposes of servicing personal ads. So this is more of a privacy thing, where, Meta's going through a separate law, bit of legal aggro in the States about whether or not they should force the divestment of Instagram and WhatsApp, which it bought. Which I think
has been dragging on for ages.
And I think it's ridiculous because I don't see how you can second guess regulators. If regulators at the time approved it, then they approved it.
Yeah.
The fact that it's ended up cornering the market in certain bits and bobs, well, they should have fucking thought of that and blocked it. Anyway, and this isn't to defend big tech. Obviously, big tech probably does behave in a semi-monopolistic way. Certainly the tax that Apple and Google put on their app stores seems excessive.
Yeah.
Anyway, but the reason I'm talking about this isn't necessarily to argue about the merits of it. And these were hundreds of millions of dollars, which will be appealed forever. And you could say that's just a cost of doing business. I saw a Guardian piece where they thought that was too low. And they thought that maybe the EU went that low to not antagonize Trump too much. Right. But then I've seen but then again, there was a Reuters piece, which is an exclusive from 2 days ago. Their headline was, US calls EU fines on Apple and Meta, quote, economic extortion. And so Reuters obviously managed to get a comment out of the White House that no one else did. And he goes, the White House said that those things were a novel form of economic extortion that the United States will not tolerate. So if you believe The Guardian, they got off lightly. If you believe Reuters and the White House spokesperson, America's really pissed off about it. And that sort of leads into what the broader thing I want to talk about, which is this. And I think lots of people agree. I've spoken to lots of people about this, a lot of them off the record, so I won't name them, that if we give Trump benefit of the doubt, and he's just going, look, fuck it. There's been a lot of stuff going on that we don't like. The Europeans don't commit enough to defence. The Chinese take the piss on trade, etc., etc. Grievance. Harvard won't get rid of its DEI policies. There's just countless things.
The shower pressure is not good enough.
Shower, yes, I heard there was a shower thing.
Priorities, First on the list kind of stuff.
And so there's all these things. And you could argue, like, I always said, I remember saying to our colleague Evan, who runs the analyst side of Omdia, I remember being in a pub with him and just going, if I had a vote in the US election, I'd vote Trump. And he was appalled and told me off and put me straight. But the reason I would have at the time was out of a sense of political impatience, wanting a disruptor, wanting a bull in a china shop, wanting someone to come in and break things, because otherwise nothing ever gets done, because the establishment, there's so much inertia, there's so much resistance to change by vested interests, that you need a nutter like Trump. That would have been my thinking at the time. The other reason I would have voted for him is to compensate for the lawfare and the shitty activities that were anti-democratic, trying to keep him out of the election through what I thought foul means. Yeah. But anyway,
although he seems like the worst anti-democrat at the moment.
Well, quite. So that was then. That's why I would have voted then. I definitely would have some buyer's remorse now.
Yeah.
Had I had a vote.
Buyer's remorse, good expression.
Yeah.
But he's been very tough on Putin, on the other hand. You naughty boy, Vlad. It was very bad timing.
Yeah, he did some...
I am not looking favorably at this attack.
Yeah, he did some Truth Social that basically went, oi, pack it in. Stop fucking bombing stuff.
I'm not gonna give you your lunch tomorrow if you do that again.
Yeah, no more fucking caviar for you.
You only get 3 more and then that's it. 6 more. Okay.
But anyway, the reason I'm framing it this way is I think everyone more or less agrees, even people who feel sympathetic towards him, although there are a few exceptions, and I might mention them because this is part of a more worrying, broader trend. People are all going, look, I get where you're coming from. Maybe the world trade system did need to get corrected. Maybe there is some piss taking going on. I've no doubt China's a massive piss taker of the world trade system when it comes to things like hidden tariffs and currency manipulation and intellectual property theft and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But he's just... So like I said, at the time, my rationale would be like, we need a bull in the china shop. Well, I think we've got too much bull in the china shop now, is my view. And this seems to be most people's view. And the problem with it is the unintended consequences and the collateral damage. So it's like he's taken this bull in the china shop idea and just fucking gone mental and just smashed every plate in the extended metaphor shop.
He's cut his hands a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this is the week when the bull sort of lies down and has a bit of a rest, isn't it?
Well, it is, but then we're getting the shockwaves, we're getting the after effects.
Yeah.
And there was like one Wall Street Journal story I've got up, which was like their front page, I think today. Corporate giants shred outlooks over tariff uncertainty. So I kind of reminded of this by the Nokia thing we were talking about at the start. But loads of other people across tons of industries are all just going. I think they quote CEO of like American Airlines, PepsiCo, Procter & Gamble, and a bunch of other
Walmart
ones from all over the place. They're all just cutting their outlooks.
Yeah.
Did you see that he said that Xi Jinping has been in touch? He's called a few times, and then China's like, no, we didn't.
Yeah, well, I don't believe anything that Trump says.
No, I think he's paving the way. I think he's saying like he's called, and he said he's called, which I don't think is a sign of weakness from him. I think he's paving the way for then actually him calling him. You know what I mean?
Maybe.
Yeah.
And then he can lie and say he was just returning his call.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I think whatever people like Trump need to do to...
Kissing my ass.
I know he actually used that. He said the whole world's kissing his ass.
No, a journalist was smart. They're like, has he been in touch since you put the tariffs down? And then he was like deflecting.
Yeah. That's a stupid question.
Has he kissed your ass?
Yeah. He's like, yeah.
And I just think there are all these unintended... Well, we presume unintended consequences. I do. That are affecting markets, affecting businesses, and all that sort of thing. Which I don't see how they could not have been foreseen. Because obviously, if everything costs more money, then we were just talking about how precarious margins are with Nokia.
Yeah.
You don't need to, and there's loads of businesses like airlines or whatever loads of sectors are on like single figure percent margins.
Farmers who ordered like all their chemicals from China,
Right.
who voted for him, were like, no, but they paid a tariff, and then they had to be explained like, no,
Yes.
you paid a tariff.
Yeah, well, a lot of people, because we didn't really talk about tariffs much until
Trump said
recently.
it himself. He said, no, I think they pay the tariff. But like, no, they don't.
Yeah, well, that is the concern, is that I think that's what really affects confidence. If you're going to be sympathetic to Trump, you try and people talk about him paying 3D chess, or they come up with other numbers like 8D chess. What the fuck does that mean? 3D chess will do. And you go, look, it's all part of your ground.
8D chess.
I know, I've just seen...
There's been many articles saying that it might be his presidency might be a colossal failure and a success at the same time.
So what I think he's counting on is he's going, look, there's method in my madness. Yes, short-term pain. But let's say, hypothetically, let's give him all the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that in a year's time, America has more favourable trade terms with everyone else in the world. Then history will look back on the current period of pain and market volatility and all that sort of thing and think it was a price worth paying. But I think the problem is it's getting harder and harder for people, not just us, but investors and rich people and people who actually to have that faith.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And people are going to lose faith quickly. And so what I thought was interesting about this EU one is Trump has sort of grouped things like fines for monopolistic behaviour in this general big bucket of what he considers to be shitty sort of trade policy towards the US. And I quite like the fact that the EU's just gone ahead and fined Apple and Meta, even though there's all this saber rattling and stuff going on. Now, it could be that Guardian piece I read was right, and actually the fine would have been a lot higher had Trump not been saber rattling.
Yeah.
But we don't know. That's a counterfactual that's impossible to prove.
But those things
I still
are
think
not too harming to these two companies, right?
no, and they'll chuck that much at lawyers.
Yeah.
It's just a cost of doing business. When you're a pseudo monopolist, you're always going to get fined, and this has been happening forever. The EU's been fining people like Intel and Microsoft forever.
Yeah.
So that's just the cost of doing business, as far as I'm concerned. If as a result of behaving in a semi-monopolistic way, they make a profit of $1 billion and then they get fined $500 million, well, they're still $500 million up, aren't they?
Yeah, but that's still pretty painful.
Yeah, but they're still $500 million up on what they would have been if they hadn't done the thing in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's a net win for them. So that's the cost of doing business argument. But I just think, just to finish off, I just think it's really interesting the effect that this is having on general global sentiment towards the US. I was reading something in The Spectator on the train on the way down about how it's had weird effects on politics of other countries, like in Canada. Canada, the right-wing party run by a bloke called Pierre Poilievre was set to win by a landslide,
Well,
and they showed a chart.
Carney's quite level, isn't he? Isn't he ahead
Oh
slightly?
yeah, well there's a chart. I mean, I won't. It will make for bad radio if I show you the chart on my phone. But basically, as soon as Trump came in, like actually got into power and started doing his Trumpy stuff, the popularity of this guy went down the toilet. Now he hadn't done anything wrong. It's just that what seems to happen is that Trump and the US state is being so obnoxious to everyone that it's bringing out that sort of that countervailing jingoism and patriotism. And so all it takes is someone like Mark Carney or whatever to stand up to him.
Yeah.
And then he yields a massive political dividend from it.
I think one consequence of Mark Carney standing up to him is that the guy that you mentioned, the Pierre, has also now started to sound more kind of belligerent towards Trump. There's no appetite in Canada at all, as far as I understand. I know one of my friends lives in Canada, for accepting any of this stuff and for going sort of meekly, we'll just go along with what you want, and sort of being bullied, which I like. I like that. Screw you. If you want to go, this way.
Sorry, he did completely. I mean, since Trudeau left, I don't know if it was. Maybe it was a personal thing actually towards him, but he completely stopped the whole 51st state. I mean, he hasn't said that in a while, at least.
Yeah, well, Mark Carney
got other
says
things
he
to
brings
think
it up.
about.
Well, it's out there. I think he
Mark
sometimes
Carney says he brings it up all the time.
Really?
Yeah, he says he brings it up all the time. He refers to people there as governor. They're like
it's like trolling, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's just trying to wind people up. I mean, we can all relate to it, like when we're out with your mates and you fuck with each other. It's just that Trump does it on a global scale.
Yeah.
And apparently, according to the Spectator piece, right-wing parties everywhere, certainly in the Anglosphere, are suffering because Trump's viewed as right wing, and I won't get into the semantics of what defines right or left wing, but because he's a Republican president and he's viewed as right wing, other parties that are viewed as right wing are suffering just by indirect association with the overall sort of political direction of travel. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to chat about. And if you two have got any other ideas, I just think it's really interesting how resonant this going to be, and how long it'll last. Like this year, it's concerning. Everyone's worried. Any of us who've got investments, who are looking at them and going, "Oh, for fuck's sake, thanks, Trump." But obviously, when you invest, you should always think that I'm investing for the long term, and whatever happens.
Fortunately, I don't have any investments. all my money.
You were
is a very
laughing.
small amount. Is
You were
all under my
laughing.
mattress.
Have you? I won't ask you to put a monetary figure on it, Pierre, but like in a percentage term, if you look at
20.
About 20, you're about 20% down. What this year are you?
Since January.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point it was down like way more. But.
Yeah, and obviously, all you'll do is you'll sit tight and hope it comes back, and I'm sure it will.
Yeah.
But so there's that, and then there's that's this year, and this year's going to be very turbulent and scary, certainly for anyone who's got investments or is directly invested in global markets and trade. But I just wonder how big an inflection point this is in a much broader timescale that will persist beyond Trump.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's just the optimist in me thinks like in the next few months we could have basically a handshake between Xi Jinping and Trump.
Yeah.
And also the end to the Ukraine war, like a double whammy in the same year. And then what could that do? I mean, obviously, we're talking about financial markets, but in the world, I don't know, that could be good.
Could be.
At what cost? We don't know yet, but
it could be, and then we'd have to hope that Trump doesn't get bored and fuck something else up.
The handshake between Xi Jinping and Trump is to do what? Agree that the tariffs thing was stupid.
Just go back to
right.
it.
So that just puts you back to where you were.
Yeah.
And the Ukraine thing.
No, the deal will be like 0.05% better for US.
The Ukraine thing I'm not optimistic about at all, because I just think there's always going to be a stalemate there, because it seems like that to end that it would require Ukraine to give up territory.
Specifically Crimea, that's what happened this week.
I
Putin
suspect,
or Trump or whatever went, you got to give up Crimea, and Zelensky went, fuck off.
I don't think it was Crimea. They won't want to withdraw from the area that they are at the moment, the Donbass area and stuff. That'll be a thing. There's no way you're ever going to get Russia to go. It won't just be Crimea. They'll use that as a pretext, but they will not. If the Ukrainians were to say we'll agree to Crimea, are they then going to withdraw from all the other territory they occupy at the moment?
No, of course not. But the point is, even your point's well made, but Zelensky's saying a hard no on Crimea, so it kind of renders the other stuff semi-relevant.
All the interviews with any Ukrainians at the moment, it's like it's a not for discussion.
No, the mayor.
He'd be out immediately. He'd have no.
Klitschko.
He's the only person who said it.
Today,
and that's not going to go down very well in Ukraine, him saying that.
But I think they should settle it by getting Putin
I can see what he's trying
Klitschko.
to do. I can see what he's trying to do by saying it.
Because he's on the ground, he's saying like...
he's trying to be a pragmatist.
We need to stop, yeah. Mm.
But the trouble is it going to be... I mean, this is getting into a telecom area.
It's all right. Well,
carry on this conversation at the pub.
Yeah, well,
maybe.
but this is the end of the pod bit where I think we're allowed a little bit more license, and we're not going to be talking for that much longer.
There's like 50 people listening now.
Yeah, exactly. But the point I was trying to make is I think it's really interesting for how much of a permanent global realignment this is going to be. We're talking about how Nokia's in the right place at the right time when it comes to defence spending. That's one thing. And the amount of diplomatic ill will that's been generated by Trump and Vance and all that sort of thing. And I think some of it's an overreaction. There's a part of me that when Vance goes to the Munich Security Conference and goes, Europe, get your fucking head out your ass.
Yeah.
There's a part of me that applauds. Yeah, but it's not very diplomatic. But
the diplomatic ill will and what's going on in Canada and all the reaction against it, and as you were saying, people not being very keen on supporting right-wing parties anymore, they could actually end up just defeating what the object of what they're trying to do in the first place. They could set their program back by doing all the crap they've done, because it's been so badly handled and so chaotic and so disruptive and so damaging. They could actually end up just setting... I mean, what you could have is a massive reaction. This, by the way, Trump's really unpopular at the moment. If you look at the...
they're worried about the midterms.
He's really unpopular. If you look at the midterms, the economist in the chart. He's there. This is the trouble with the American system. It's not a very good democracy, frankly. But because he's there now for what, 3.5 years.
But he'll be a lame duck for 2 of them.
But you could end up with a massive swing the other way next time round if this carries on.
Yes,
I
think so. And then the other thing that we've learnt from it, and we knew it already.
I mean, they did put a senile guy in there.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically. The American electorate has had very poor choices for a long time, and I'm not saying we have brilliant ones in England.
They need a hero to step up.
But people like Keir Starmer,
at
least Keir Starmer's just a bit boring.
I mean, we don't have geriatrics competing to run the country. That's the problem.
And megalomaniacal nut
people
jobs.
who are on death's door, for Christ's sake. It's ridiculous.
But the other thing it's reminded us of, so that's a thought that, are we still going to be feeling the effects of this in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years' time?
Yeah.
And it could be that, because it's always interesting to think about history. In fact, there's a little shout out. I know you listen to The Rest is History. They've just done a couple on the Rolling Stones, which is quite fun.
I was
just listening to. Yeah, just talking about, just looking at the Stones from a historical point of view.
I'm still in their 1066 series.
Right. But if you imagine that you're Holland and what's the other guy's name? It's just Sandbrook.
Yeah,
if you're people like Holland and Sandbrook, and then you're writing historical account of this now in 50 years' time, just like their historical account of the Rolling Stones is, that's got about a 60-year gap. Are you going to view it as a massive inflection point, or is it just going to be a little aberration that in 5 years' time we're all just like, oh, that was a bit weird, a bit like coronavirus? I don't know how much lingering effect coronavirus had, but it certainly at the time seemed like one of the most seismic things ever.
It'll get written up. It hasn't had a lingering effect, I think.
No.
I think people were speculating that it would lead to massive shifts. People won't go into town centres anymore.
Yeah. I think there have been some effects, like more working from home and a bit more
but even that's
malingering.
Being rowed back, isn't it? So
yeah.
I think it's not been, but it will still be remembered in the way.
Do you think this Trump? I'll ask both of you. Do you think what Trump's doing right now, which we know is very consequential in the short term?
Yeah.
Do you think in, let's say, 20 years' time, we're still going to be feeling the effects of it, or do you think it'll be shrugged off?
I think it's too early to say.
Yeah.
I think it's far too early to say.
It's a bit of an unfair question to throw at you.
I mean, I think it's a really good question to ask, but I just think from my perspective, it's too early to say because we don't really know. It's all so chaotic. We don't really know what could happen over the next few months. We don't really know what.
It's so hard to make any call.
I mean, the polls at the moment, he's not very popular. He was saying right-wing parties are out of favour, but things go in swings and roundabouts. We don't really know at the moment where it could lead. It could lead to some massive backlash against all this kind of stuff, or it could lead to. It could lead to. I mean. It could lead, if it's a geopolitical... I mean, The Economist was framing this as all of a sudden the world order's changed because they like to do these big dramatic pieces. It's transactional now and we can't rely on the US anymore and NATO's over. I mean, I think that's taking it too far, frankly. But it could go that way. It could lead to Europe making an effort to actually be more of a powerful bloc in its own right.
They can get a bit more of a sense of urgency about them. Yeah. What do you think, Pierre? Do you think this is going to linger for decades to come?
No, I mean, it's like your Rolling Stones, if I could do an analogy, when they release those hits, I'm sure like on the day of release, you listen to them for the first few times, you'd be like, oh, yeah, it's a pretty good song. But then as time went on, that's when you realize this is a classic hit.
Yeah.
On the day you probably thought, yeah, this is pretty good. Or maybe you didn't like it actually because it was new. So now with Trump, we have no idea really.
There was the Chinese ambassador like years ago, like the guy who was like the Chinese ambassador to the UK 20 years ago or something, apparently got asked by some journalists what he thought of the French Revolution and like what the impact of it had been on society, and his answer was, it's too early to say.
Right. Now. Yeah.
That's a very Chinese answer, isn't it?
Right.
I wouldn't take it that far, but I certainly think...
That's one of the things where you kind of bet against Trump in his battle of wills with Xi Jinping is the Chinese are notoriously patient. Yeah. And of course they've got their command economy. Xi Jinping doesn't have to worry about getting voted out. Yeah. Or anything like that. So he can just sit tight and go for it.
No, the economy is not doing so well though.
No, but I think I don't know, I could be right. I know they do get domestic pressures, even though he's got a much more of an iron grip on power than a democratic politician would have. But I think on the flip side, like we're talking about coronavirus, they were able to lock down earlier and more severely and for longer in China.
Yeah.
So there's more population control there, and they've famously got a very sophisticated surveillance state and
They
all
have a
that
higher
sort of thing.
pain tolerance, yeah.
Yeah, so he could just be betting that the American electorate's going to freak out before whatever. I mean, we can't even call the Chinese population an electorate because they don't have elections. But the American people are going to freak out before the Chinese people. And then just one last thing, talking about like those different countries, what it's really done is just reminded us how globally interconnected we all are. Mm-hmm. So, this America first, this isolationist, this fuck the rest of you, we'll just take care of ourselves. And we kind of chatted about this, Ian, I think when we led with the tariffs a few weeks ago, this autocracy or autarky or whatever they call it, where you're just inward looking and self-reliant, and you just trade with yourself. I just don't think that's possible. Because everything's so interconnected, and all these knock-on effects. There isn't a single American company that I can think of. Even someone like Tesla, which apparently does a hell of a lot of its manufacturing in the US.
Netflix has been quite bulletproof during this time, but
but because most of this stuff concerns people who actually produce physical things.
Yeah.
So if it's just digital services, that's kind of a different conversation. But there's no American company that actually produces stuff that doesn't source the components or the manufacturing or some bits of it from all over the world. Yeah. So if nothing else, Trump, and I don't think this was his intention, but if nothing else, Trump's proven that you can't isolate yourself from the rest of the world. Yeah. It's just not possible. So yeah, interesting times. All right, I think we've done about 2 hours, haven't we? Unless anyone else got any last thoughts on that, we'll call it a day and we'll take it to the pub. And so, I'll just say thanks a lot for listening and make sure you join us for the next one.